In our last segment, we began our discussion about interest groups and the importance of interest groups. And today we're going to continue, in this section, continue our discussion about interest groups. In particular, we're going to be talking about the influence of interest groups in terms of what they do, and also in terms of whether or not interest groups are good or not good for our political system. A second thing that, or activity that interest groups are very much involved in is raising money through political action committees. As you may remember in our discussion about campaign finance, the federal and state laws do not permit interest groups to raise money and give money directly to campaigns, but they can do it indirectly through political action committees. So the funding process is carried out by affiliated political action committees. And again, just to give you an example of that, if I am a member of an executive with the automobile industry, I'm very much concerned about our industry being healthy and having plenty of jobs and help make America strong by putting people to work in the automobile industry. I want to make sure that their members of Congress pass laws that are favorable to my industry. And so I may actually create a political action committee or work with other automobile manufacturers, and we'll create a consortium, and through that consortium create a political action committee that is designed to raise money specifically to give to candidates all across America, to all congressional candidates who favor enacting laws that are beneficial to the automobile industry. So, this is what PACs do, and PACs will raise this money for that purpose. There are over 4,600 PACs in Washington, D.C. alone, and in the last election, the direct contributions to all races in Congress, Senate and the House, was well over $500 million. Now, so the idea is that we're looking for, as a member of the PAC, we're looking to give money to different candidates, and we have limits in terms of how much money we can give directly, but we can also raise money indirectly on their behalf, or advocate or run advertisements on the behalf, and that's unlimited. So there's a lot of money that goes into this process. Now, the question is, does this, a lot of people criticize this because they say that this actually leads to a corrupting influence on members of Congress, because Congress relies so much money, so much of their campaign is based upon money coming from PACs. Does that actually translate to buying votes? Do the PACs create an undue influence on members of Congress? And I think while the evidence is mixed regarding that influence, interest groups hope that the contribution of a PAC to a candidate, or the contribution of PAC money to a candidate, will give the lobbyist access to the elected officials in order to present their case. So if I go back to the example about the American Banking Association, and I say, well, our PAC gave a lot of money over the last several years to your candidate, or to you, Senator McCaskill, for your last election. The idea behind that is you remind them of how much we have worked on your behalf, on behalf of the member of Congress, to get elected or re-elected. And because of that, if nothing else, the argument that they make is, while PAC money doesn't necessarily buy influence, it certainly buys access. There's no question about that. It definitely buys access. And of course, many groups are also to show you how much money is going into this process. Many groups are sidestepping some of the formal restrictions placed upon PACs by creating 527 organizations. Remember the 527s that we talked about in terms of campaign finance before. And these are not regulated by the Federal Election Committee, the Federal Election Commission. So a lot of the interest groups use the PAC process, but they also are now beginning increasingly to use a 527 process because that gives them even more freer hand in terms of raising money for candidates. You can go, for example, to the Federal Election Commission, www.fec.gov, and you can see, for example, on that site, you can get some information about how PACs are giving money to candidates. You can look it up in terms of your particular area and how much different PACs have given in terms of money in the last election to the candidates in your district or the people your representatives. You can also see the influence of PACs, PAC funding, at another site, for example, opensecrets.org, to get a feel for how much PACs are giving money to different candidates and which PACs are giving the most money to candidates. But this is very, very clear here. One of the major roles of interest groups is to raise money, and they do it indirectly through PACs and through these 527s, specifically for giving money to candidates who support their views. And so if you've been in Congress for a number of years and you have a voting record, for example, that's very favorable to, say, gun control, then you're going to get money from PACs that favor gun control. Or let's say that you're opposed to gun control. You're going to get a lot of money from various PACs and interest groups that are opposed to gun control. So that's, again, a very, very big process. Now, besides lobbying, besides raising money through political action committees and 527s, okay, interest groups are also very much involved in the process of litigation. Interest groups, when I say litigation, they're involved in playing a role in terms of court cases that may become, particularly before maybe the Supreme Court. I'll give you a quick example. I mean, interest groups may bring a suit or support a suit that's already in progress that may favor one particular side of a court case, again, in an attempt to influence public policy. Probably one of the easiest and most famous examples of this would be the NAACP. They played a major role, a critical role, in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ended school desegregation. One of the leading attorneys for the NAACP was Thurgood Marshall, and Thurgood Marshall ended up becoming the first African American to be appointed as a justice to the Supreme Court. Well, he became famous in part because of his role in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education. But in any case, there could be other groups. Let's say, for example, the National Abortion Rights Action League. They hire as part of their staff a team of lawyers who may be involved in writing legal briefs that are in support of a case. Let's say, for example, that the Supreme Court was going to reconsider a Roe versus Wade. Maybe there's a new court case coming up, we'll call it Roe versus Wade 2. And as part of this, the National Abortion Rights Action League may submit what's called an amicus curiae brief, which is a friend of the court brief, a supporting brief, which is a legal document outlining, in their case, why reproductive choice should be maintained, while the basic provisions of Roe versus Wade should be maintained, why Roe versus Wade should not be overturned. And they will be presenting the arguments they will submit to the Supreme Court. So that's the idea behind litigation. Many different groups are engaged in litigation in this way, all right? And they're basically involved in writing these different kinds of briefs with the idea of supporting a particular side of some major court cases that have some very significant public policy implications. And so that can be, again, another major role that they play, besides lobbying and besides raising money through PACs, political action committees. Now, that comes up to basically the idea of what gives interest groups their power. You know, we say that they are powerful, there are many of them, and these are some of the things they do. Why is it that some interest groups are perhaps more successful than others? And the book talks about some of this to some degree. But obviously, I would say two particular components of this would be the size of the interest group, how many members there are, but not just how many members, but how unified they are in terms of their views. When interest groups are large and they're unified, then these interest groups can mobilize a large number of people to write or call members of Congress to influence legislation. They can mobilize large amounts of money and energy in the service of a cause or an issue. There is strength in numbers, especially when those numbers are united. The most effective lobbyists can be those who have large voters across the United States who vote. And the most effective ones are those who do a lot of grassroots organizing. So I think, for example, about the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. I remember, for example, my parents who were members of the AARP. It's a large organization, and they would get a letter from the director of the AARP, and they would say, for example, that Congress is considering some legislation right now that's pending in Congress that has a significant effect on your Social Security benefits. You need to call your member of Congress right now and tell them, for example, that you support House Resolution 131. H.R. 131, which is the idea which is designed to help preserve the benefits, the Social Security benefits for senior citizens. It could be, something that relates to the interest of those who are retired. Some of these groups will go so far as that they will even send in that package, or that mailer package, and this is, for example, the one that I saw with my parents, a letter already written to their member of Congress, their member of the House of Representatives, and basically saying, "Dear Representative so-and-so, we urge for you to support House Bill or House Resolution 121 that contains these provisions, and here are the reasons why." So the letter is already written, and all they want you to do, that is the AARP, is just to sign this letter, fold it up, and put it in the self-addressed stamped envelope and mail it off. And all of a sudden you see in Congress floods, a ton of letters that will come in a given week. And if I'm a representative, in this area, I'll be talking to my staff people, and I'll be saying, how many letters have we gotten in from senior citizens who are concerned about H.R. 121? And we may have found that over the past week or so, we've gotten thousands of letters, they're all the same letter basically, urging my support. But it gives me, if nothing else, a gauge of how important this issue is. But this is a good example of grassroots organizing to mobilize the support of lots of voters in support of a particular cause to influence legislation. All right, so again, that can be a very, very important thing. So if you have an interest group that's very large, very powerful in terms of their size, but also in terms of they're unified. The National Rifle Association is another good example. There are members of the National Rifle Association all throughout the country. And the NRA, if you're a member of the NRA, you may get a letter like that saying, call your member of Congress, or here, sign this letter that goes to your member of Congress saying ask for your support. So that can be a very important source of power for the interest group. All right, and very, very effective. Now, another important resource is the ability to provide elected officials and members of the bureaucracy with important information and expertise. These officials who work in bureaucracy, as well as members of Congress, staff people who are writing up legislation or who are crafting regulations in the bureaucracy, these officials need accurate and up-to-the-minute information when they are writing regulations or legislation. So they depend on people who have a strong interest in some issue to help supply that information. And again, as relationships are cultivated with members of the bureaucracy, as relationships are cultivated with members of Congress or staff members who work for members of Congress, these relationships then, provide the interest groups with a very important source of information. Lobbyists can tell you, if you are a member of Congress, a lobbyist can tell you the likely impact of a bill on how it may affect the constituents in your district. If this bill is passed, here's what's going to happen to the constituents in your district. And that can be very important information to help influence how you support your position on a bill. So they can play a very, very important role there. In terms of providing information and expertise, many times interest groups will testify in congressional hearings. They'll come before a panel of members of Congress and testify on why we need to strengthen regulations, or why we need to change regulations, or why we need to change the law to allow for other kinds of things to happen. So being able to testify in congressional hearings, again, is an example of providing information and expertise to members of Congress. So This can be a very important source of power for the interest group because they're always on top of that area. All right? And many agencies in the bureaucracy and many staff members have come to rely upon information that interest groups provide. But keep this in mind, this is, I think, very important. The information that lobbyists provide to bureaucracy or to Congress has to be credible information. If lobbyists misrepresent an issue or give bad information, that can seriously damage the long-term credibility with members of the bureaucracy or with the legislators. All right? So again, that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. But again, that can be a very influential source of power, is that ability to provide credible, up-to-date, accurate information and expertise that helps Congress and the bureaucracy do their job. Now, besides this, one other thing I'll say, now those are the three basic things, the size, but also unity, the information expertise. All right, I guess that's the second one. The third thing that I'll say as a power, what basically gives interest groups their power, is this idea of their natural ability to work in something that I call the iron triangle. Now, I may have to let me step back for a minute and talk to you a little bit about the iron triangle. I'm going to put up a little diagram here to help you understand the iron triangle. The iron triangle, first of all, is a model of policy making. It's only one model, and it's a fairly influential model, but there are other models that compete with it too in terms of saying this is a better way to describe how policies are made. The iron triangle is only one way in which that describes how policies are made, and they apply to any, you can apply them to a whole range of different kinds of policies, like defense policy. It's a pretty useful model. I'll bring it up because it describes, in a lot of ways, underscores the importance of interest groups in the iron triangle. Now, as you see from the picture of this triangle here, it's got three components or three sets of actors. All right, you've got on the one point here, you've got the interest group. Another key actor is Congress, and specifically the congressional committee or subcommittee. When we talk about Congress, we'll talk about the role of committees and subcommittees. But you've got Congress as an actor, you've got interest groups as an actor, and then you also have the relevant federal department or agency that the interest group is concerned about, all right, as an actor. So these three actors comprise the iron triangle. And the reason why they call them the iron triangle is because it's the idea that how policies are made, and they're kind of impervious to other actors who are outside the iron triangle. And so, it just, I think, underscores the influence. And let me just show you an example of how that would work in terms of defense. If we think about defense policy, how defense policy is made, who is the relevant department, agency, or the relevant federal department or agency? That, of course, would be the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. The congressional committee could be, for example, the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is involved in setting the budget and making very important key decisions about weapons programs for the military. So you've got Congress and the various committees and subcommittees. You've got the Department of Defense, and now who is a particular interest group in this case? This would be basically maybe defense contractors, defense weapons manufacturers. And as you see, and we'll talk about this more in terms of public policy, but I'll just share with you briefly. Basically, the defense weapons manufacturers will give money through political action committees, for example, will give money to members of Congress to help support a strong defense, because a strong defense is a strong profit. People in the Department of Defense also believe in a strong defense. And so you've got basically a very nice kind of cozy relationship. In fact, some books talk about iron triangles as cozy triangles. And there's a very, very close symbiotic relationship between, in this case, the defense weapons manufacturers, the Pentagon, and members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So they're all working together in terms of mutual interest. And so essentially, through the PAC money that's given, members of Congress will pass legislation that reflects a strong defense. And that money that's reflected in strong defense is shown up in terms of the defense budget that provides money for various types of weapon systems. Okay? So basically then you see how the interest groups in the iron triangle model of policymaking are connected to the system through this iron triangle operation. Each component serves the interest of each other, all right, each of the actors. So we'll talk about more of this again when we talk about public policies, but just want to give you an overview here to talk about in terms of what the iron triangle is and underscore, in this case, the role of interest groups. So The point here is this, as far as the iron triangles are concerned. Our defense contracts that are created may not necessarily be in the best interest of the country as a whole. Now, they could be, but not necessarily. It may not be in the best interest of the country as a whole to build more weapons, but it is certainly in the interest of these defense manufacturers to do so. All right? And so that is, again, it underscores the idea of these iron triangles at play. Sometimes policies are made that reflect the prerogatives and the interest of these interest groups. And this is a nice way of looking at this, depicting this through this model of the iron triangle. Now, the last thing I'll talk about in terms of interest group is this, and that is, are interest groups good for democracy or are they bad for democracy? Are they part of this wonderful pluralist model that helps to channel people's participation and interest in a multitude of ways, or do they lead to corruption of our system? And I'll tell you right now, I think you can find evidence for both. There are certainly some problems that interest groups pose for democracy, but are interest groups bad for our system? Should we cut out interest groups and regulate them and say they can't play a role or reduce their role? Well, a lot of critics of interest groups say that interest groups can be bad for democracy because, as I suggested earlier, interest groups tend to represent narrow interests, especially those of the economically advantaged. Certainly some groups are represented more than others. They have better access to the system because they are better off financially. People who are well off financially are more likely than poor people, for example, to join interest groups, to be active in those groups. And interest groups that represent business and the professions and these economic interests, as I talked about, are much more numerous and better financed than those that represent, for example, minorities, consumers, the children, or the disadvantaged in other ways. And so, again, for over half of the myriad of interest groups represented in Washington are actually corporations, and about another third are professional and trade associations, while only about 4% are public interest groups and fewer than 2% are civil rights or minority groups. And so the question is, boy, is this fair? You've got the deck stacked against those who are in favor of the high-priced lobbyists and those who represent corporate interest. So a lot of people say that that's really not a really good reflection of that. The interest groups basically are corrupt, or they're having corrupting influence over our system. And that because of that, the laws and the policies that we create really reflect much more of their interests than the country as a whole. Now, on the other hand, I will give you some other examples. There is a group that represents your interests, the U.S. Student Association, who makes sure that have lobbyists in Washington who are there to make sure that you can get loans, federal and state loans, school loans to go to school that are below market interest rates. And the idea behind that is to help make sure that you are provided an adequate education. The U.S. Student Association helps to make sure that there's adequate funding for universities all across the country. Make sure there's more money for community colleges as well as universities. And so the idea is that they want to have more money channeled. They want to have more of a bigger piece of the pie of overall budget going to education. Is that a bad thing? Is that a corrupt thing? Is the U.S. Student Association corrupt? What about groups like the Christian Coalition, who feel very strongly about having prayer in schools and reducing abortion in our society? Is that a bad thing or not? So the point here is that, I just want you to understand, is that one person's interest is seen as legitimate, somebody else's it may not be seen as legitimate. But the point here is that if since we have all these different interests in our society, and since we have government responding to these through our pluralist model, it does help shape the formation of public policy. Now, whether again you think that's a corrupt process or not, again, it depends upon what particular activities you may be looking at. But in any case, if nothing else, depending nevertheless on whether you think they're corrupt or not, it's still, I think, a fair statement to suggest that interest groups certainly do play a very important role as one of the major actors in our political system. And that influence is going to remain for some time to come. This concludes our discussion of interest groups. Next time we meet, we're going to move on in to talk about Congress and the role of Congress. Until then, this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.